Welcome back to another episode of Sibling Showdown, the Best Ball Edition. I'm Meg, and you can find me on Twitter at Megs08DFS, and I'm joined by my sibling, my brother, of course, Steve, and you can find him at SteveOSpeak on Twitter. And today we are talking about stacking up good offenses. And kind of in the wake of, this is the NFL schedule release, a lot of people are going to be talking about, week 17 correlations, and we'll talk about that. That's a piece to the puzzle, but we are really going to be talking about ways to stack up good top offenses. So Steve, I want to bring you in. How are you doing today? Ready to talk about some high powered offenses?
I'm doing good. And yeah, I think this really is one of the keys for best ball is finding the right offenses and locking in on them.
Exactly. And it's, I think, I want to say a bit of an underrated strategy or key to best ball that people don't talk about enough. You will hear a lot of strategy talk that is important. Again, these big strategies are important to discuss about, team stacking, week 17 stacking, you'll obviously ADP value. All these things are pieces to the puzzle. I think some people overdo some of them, overstack, over week 17 stack. That's my opinion. I think, again, these are all pieces of puzzle. These are all strategies that I incorporate and use in best ball, but I think the one that I really want to hyper focus on the most is just stacking pieces to good offenses, because that's the one that I personally, when I look back at results, have found to be the most successful. And again, this week is the NFL schedule release. Very, very exciting. You're going to hear a lot of best ball content about week 17 correlation. Again, nothing wrong with that. I do think, you just have to be careful about overstacking that. I don't think there's enough data yet to really show like how many, teams don't even make the playoffs or don't advance in the playoffs because they overstacked week 17. So that's just something I'd say I want to keep in mind. Again, I'm open to it, but I don't want to overdo it. And again, I'm excited for the schedule release too, but I'm just going to be keying in on, we already know who they're playing, but what offenses I want to target. Do you have anything to add to that before we jump right into this?
No, I mean, I think, I think there's obviously some value with week 17 correlation, but sometimes I think people look at it and look at just an average bring back and think that hits, and they're like, oh, this worked. But that average player who got 12, 15 points, I mean, was replicated by 20 other guys around at wide receiver or running back that week that you could have had in your flex instead. So it's like, and many of those outscoring them. So, might have cost you by doing it that way. So, I think that's to keep in mind. And like you said, there's a lot of stacks that don't work, especially if and we will talk about this later, but when you get to that overstacking portion where you're so focused on those two teams, it can definitely hurt your outcome.
Yeah, especially if they're not too, again, what we're talking about. People are going to be talking about week 17 correlations, stacking two teams that play each other week 17. We're talking about maybe getting access to 2, 3, 4 teams that we just believe are going to be in the top 10 top offenses. We're going to look at more at that, or maybe an undervalued offense that could be what Detroit and Jacksonville were last year. People weren't really on them as far as the top offenses. Their guys were mostly going later. You're getting great ADP value for them, and they ended up being top 10 offenses, scoring offenses. So these are the kind of offenses that we want to stack up. I mean, I use, we'll do some more week 17 stuff later this summer, but I use that as like a tiebreaker sometimes, especially later in the draft. It doesn't hurt, if you're especially later in the draft, as if a tiebreaker decision, something along those lines. We could talk about more of that later, but again, we're not like knocking it. We're just saying sometimes I think it's overdone, overstacked, and that can be problematic. What we want to focus on is stacking up those top offenses. So let's jump into the ways we want to stack up top offenses. First, I want to bring over a great tweet from Pat Thorman on Twitter. Let me bring that over.
Thorman of Establish the Run.
Yeah, Pat Thorman, Establish the Run.
You can set fantastic fantasy work in general, and definitely, Establish the Run is doing a lot of great best ball content. But he had a great tweet today talking about finding the offense, the scoring offenses, and he did
basically what you and I have been talking about the last couple of weeks.
The work for us of eliminating the defensive points and just where that kind of balanced out. And I'll let you kind of give some of the highlights that he talked about.
Yeah, he basically said his highlights from 2022 scoring, because again, he took out defense and special teams. New England dropped from respectable 17th down to 22nd.
Mhm.
Chargers actually a top 10 scoring offense. Miami not a top 12 offense. The big Tua asterisks on
Yeah.
that. They were 13th, but again, when Tua was there,
Yeah.
that was a different story. Chicago DST didn't score a single point, and Denver offense only felt like the league's worst. So I guess they were 28th in scoring. It did feel like they were
Yeah.
the league's worst. So again, great tweet from Pat Thorman of Established a Run, and it actually shows the top scoring offenses. And let me read them, and we're going to bring over another Pro Football Reference to look at this in more detail and some different data points too. But obviously, in order, it's who you think. It's right. Chiefs, Eagles, Cowboys, Lions, Bills, 49ers, Bengals, Vikings, Seahawks, Chargers. And then again, some ones right on the cusp that were very, applicable to best ball last year. Jaguars, Raiders, Dolphins. So that I think that's very informative.
Yeah.
And we're going to look at some more data in detail, but that kind of sets up what we want to be looking at. We want to be looking for these top 10 scoring offenses. So I'm going to bring over and talk about that a little bit more as I bring over. I'm going to be bringing over
So,
Pro Football Reference and talk about the different data points we're going to look at there.
yeah. So just to hang on that tweet for a second, if you look at it, he breaks it down their points per game. You have Chiefs and Eagles at 28 plus points per game. You've got a lot of teams in the 24 plus range, and then those teams at the bottom, we're talking teams only getting 17, 16, 15 offensive points per game. I mean, that's a 10 plus point difference in some cases. That's a lot. That's going to just dramatically add up just the just how many fewer touchdowns opportunities there are for those guys. So if you're taking receivers and you have a chance to get one from a team that's going to score 26 points a game and one that's going to score 15 points a game, well, I think we know which one you want. And obviously that's looking back. We need to project forward because as you mentioned, the Jaguars were one of those teams that was only scoring 15 points a game 2 years ago.
Yeah.
They get Doug Peterson, Trevor Lawrence grows, get some weapons, and now they're much
they
higher,
put a lot in free agency to their offensive skill positions. Yeah.
So just because, say, the Broncos or some of these other teams at the bottom were really bad last year, maybe there will be things to boost them up, and we'll definitely get into that more later in the show, and of course going forward throughout the summer.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. So first data point, again, this is Pro Football Reference that we're looking at, is basically what Pat Thorman looked at. Now, this is top scoring offenses, and this does have, as you can see, like the special teams and defensive touchdowns in it. So it's all touchdowns that we're sorting by. But again, it's, these, top, 12 or so were the offenses that you wanted to target last year: Chiefs, Eagles, Cowboys, Lions, 49ers, Bills, Bengals, Vikings, Dolphins, Jaguars, Seahawks. These were the offenses you wanted to target. And that's again what we want to keep in mind. So we're looking at touchdowns. That's obviously a big part of fantasy output. Steve, do you want me to pull up on Pro Football Reference some of the other things that we want to maybe look at when you're looking at data? Like,
first here, I think it's important to look at and look, we were both high in the Jaguars last year. Excuse me. They had 41 offensive touchdowns to defensive and special teams.
Right.
From that 45. So they had 41. That's 20, almost 20 touchdowns. Chiefs only had 2 defenses, so they were at 59. Eagles only had 2. So there's almost a 20 touchdown gap between Chiefs and Eagles and where the Jaguars, who were 10th in total touchdowns, were.
Right.
And in Thorman's thing, I think they ended 11th.
Right.
So, that just shows you there's a big gap there. And then if you go down further, just if you could go down a little further, look at a team like, for instance, say the Saints, 36 touchdowns compared to the Chiefs getting 59. I mean, we're just talking major gaps here. And this is where it gets separating, where, Chris Olave looks great, but, we need to look at where he's going against other guys in top offenses.
Yeah, it's good to put some context to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, obviously, if you think Derek Carr helps jumpstart this offense,
right,
then maybe Olave is still worth it. But those are the types of things that we need to absolutely keep in mind when we are making projections this year.
Yep.
And just those ADP player versus player battles, because end of the day, we want to get the guys who are going to be in these high powered offenses, get the most points. And, the other key for fantasy, of course, is yards. And we see big discrepancies there as well.
Right.
On the
Well,
sheet.
before we get to the yards, I think we're obviously going to want to target a lot of these same top 10 offense, top 10, top 12 offenses. The Thorman's list, this list, we're going to want access to them. And that's kind of going to be our wish list of offenses we want to target. But what kind of data points or things are you going to be looking at this summer to kind of try to unearth the Jaguars and Lions of last year? Obviously, an obvious one is, free agency moves were what kind of helped, or, second year growth was like head coaching changes. I named three things. Obviously, that was the key for the Jaguars. Free agency moves is a big one. Obviously, Aaron Rodgers goes to the Jets. I think Aaron Rodgers upgraded from Zach Wilson is night and day. That's a big one that sticks out to me. So would you say draft, free agency, coaching changes, coaching? I know you wrote an article about the NFC play caller changes, and then you're going to write one about the AFC too, play caller changes. So I covered, NFL draft, free agency, coaching changes, free agent or play calling changes, and then what was the other one? Just growth, perhaps in a player's development. Obviously, that was big. A third year Jalen Hurts. I was bearish on that. I was not, and I'll take the L on that for sure. But he did have immense third year growth. So looking for that second or third year growth, I'm throwing it out there. Maybe Kenny Pickett is a second year growth candidate. Those are the kind of things that I'm thinking of. Anything to add on that before we look at other data points to again, unearth those like ones that weren't in the top 12, this 10, 12 this year, but will be in the top 10 or 12 when we look back at 2023.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of things. I think obviously each team you do have to start digging into individually,
Sure.
because, like it's not just free agency moves. We see other teams that had, some big free agency splashes, whether this past year or years in the past, that just fell flat on their face, trades that didn't work out, et cetera.
Yeah.
And same with coaching changes and things of that nature. But when it starts to all come together, and just building the team, I think you can start taking shots, making some bets on them. Last year the big Russell Wilson trade to Denver did not work out. They were one of the least scoring offenses despite all the talent they had there. Obviously that was a coaching change that didn't work out. Will this one going to Sean Payton change that?
Right.
As much as people want to be down on Russell Wilson, that 2017-ish to 2022, not only was he out winning games, but he was one of the best fantasy quarterbacks there was. In 2020, he finished like fourth or fifth. So,
which year did he finish, fourth or fifth? Was that 21?
I want to say 2020 and
2020.
And even in 2021, I mean, he dealt with that thumb issue.
Oh, that's right. That's
right. He had multiple 20-point games, including week 17. He helped win some people some money in best ball, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So, it's definitely identifying those types of guys in those types of teams and situations. I think looking at efficiency, because that is one thing that can transfer. So if a quarterback, and this doesn't always work. I mean, Jalen Hurts was not super efficient, became much more efficient last year. We saw Josh Allen, his year 1, year 2 was not very efficient, became very efficient year 3.
Yep.
But sometimes that can translate where, they were relatively efficient, but they just didn't have enough talent around them. So that can be a big thing. Same with, they offensive line ran well, but the running back was hurt. So it was the second and third running back. Now the top guy's back. Maybe they're going to be better. Those types of things we need to look at. But one key thing and lower is red zone.
I was going to say, let me find that here.
Yeah.
There we go.
That's lower. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you want me to highlight the red zone attempts or percentage first?
Well, I think First attempts,
Yeah.
because
Okay.
these are offenses that got into the red zone, even if they weren't super efficient. One I wanted to highlight here was, um,
So
uh,
shocker, Chiefs are the top.
yeah, I think that was a given. But and this is one to speak to the Jaguars. They are ninth on this list, but
Hmm.
their efficiency is pretty low.
Yeah.
So there could be more growth there, especially adding Calvin
Yeah.
Ridley coming back.
Right.
Same, with the Ravens. They are very high in this list. Of course, losing Lamar, losing
Hmm.
receivers, all that. Now they're
Yeah. The
getting Lamar
percentage
back.
is
They're
low.
adding all these weapons. Dobbins, a 4 year removed from his injury.
Right.
They could be very, very good scoring. And if you could go a little lower,
Yeah.
right there, the Seattle.
Yep.
Um, you know,
55 red zone
just
attempts.
a little behind the top 10, but again, another one really low efficiency, 47%. Gino was really good in between the 20s. The offense was not as good, in the
Oops.
red zone. They were still very good. Look, they had bookend rookie offense tackles last year. They should get better. They had Charbonnet to go with Walker. That's a 1-2 punch at running back that anyone would want. And then of course JSN for that third receiver weapon. So
Hmm.
this is a team that we could see really elevate their scoring potential.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. Is that's a way to look at this data and say, okay, they had this many red zone attempts, almost like how you look in golf, like their ball striking was good, but the putting just didn't get them home. This
Yeah,
is kind of the same kind of thing.
exactly.
They got into the red zone, but the red zone percentage wasn't great. So they weren't getting home on touchdowns. They just settled for a lot of field goals. Like you said, that might be some more room for growth for the Jaguars. Definitely a bounce back for the Ravens. Seahawks
Mhm.
in another year with more weapons. So I think that's an excellent point as you try to pour through this data, and obviously definitely recommend Pro Football Reference for something like this. Any other specific teams that are standing out to you as far as the attempts? Obviously, if you want to look, getting yourself there is key. And again, it really is the similar list of teams: Chiefs, Lions, Vikings, 49ers, Chargers, Eagles, Ravens, Bills, Jaguars, Bengals, Cowboys. Actually, Browns are in the top 12. So
Yeah.
that's the top 12 of attempts. Did you want me to highlight the percentage, just who was most efficient?
Yeah, I think that is key to look at, and this is the other thing. Cowboys weren't in the top, but as high in terms of attempts, pretty respectable. But again,
Well, I
remember
was going to
Dak
say Cowboys was still 11th.
11th,
So
just outside
yeah,
the top 10.
yeah,
But you have to remember Dak missed 5 games.
yeah,
So, what happened, and Gallup coming off the injury, Dalton Schultz missed some time. They didn't
yeah,
have a third receiver. They're now adding Brandon Cooks, and the whole Kellen Moore situation I understand, but there's a lot of potential for this offense if they can stay healthy. So, I think that's a key thing to keep in mind. Excuse me. I think one that definitely worries me at the top is the Titans.
yeah,
They didn't have a ton of red zone attempts.
right.
Some of that, of course, due to Tannehill missing a bunch of games and their backup quarterbacks just not playing well at
Being
all.
bad. Yeah.
Um, their percentage was high, obviously, because of Derrick Henry. The
Hmm.
downside is they lost a lot along the offensive line. They did get Skoronski in the first round of the draft, but this offensive line is probably the worst Henry's run behind.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's concerning, and they don't have a lot of other weapons. So
Right.
I would not be surprised if they are much, much lower. Sure, when Henry gets close, he's still the best in the game at getting
Yeah.
getting those last 5 yards. But
Trying to get big dog down. Yeah.
um, but yeah, that's just one that really, really would worry me at the top.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
Cardinals would be another one. Obviously, their attempts were low again, missing a lot of key pieces. Kyler throughout
Yeah.
the year, Ertz, Hopkins, the suspension, et cetera, et cetera. And we just don't know with this offense.
Yeah.
That was one that, and that's the thing. Sometimes you don't know because injuries have such an impact. Cardinals have been like a top 10 offense the previous couple of years, and then of course all the missed time. I mean, their offensive line was one of the most injured throughout the season. Just a total mess. So we'll see. Maybe they can bounce back, but I think we'd want to have a green light that Kyler is going to be healthy before we got really excited of them having a bounce back. They could actually fall if Kyler's missing some time at the start.
Right. Right. Another one to just point out here: Carolina Panthers. They're going to be a young team. You have a rookie quarterback, and but the first overall pick, and I know people were very excited about a rookie receiver in Mingo. They got Adam Thielen. They got Miles Sanders. You know, red zone attempts. They are 12th in efficiency. Had 46 attempts, so not great. I'm sorry, this keeps jumping around. But I don't know. That might be one that could be like, I don't know. Would you be maybe point to them as one where very young
Yeah,
team, but could be for their ADP give you some value as from an
yeah. I mean,
offense?
I think the obviously the tough thing with them is basically anyone who was part of last year from a skill position, quarterback,
Is
or even
gone.
coaching staff is not
Yeah,
there.
yeah,
What I
that's
will
true.
say, and this,
But I was gonna say
is a
offensive line. Go
their
ahead. Yeah.
offensive line is very strong.
Yes.
So that is one thing that Young walks into very
Right.
well early on. And I do think the Miles Sanders pickup, we saw him touchdown hunt last year. Might
Yep.
not get, as many red zone trips, obviously, as the Eagles, but I don't know if Bryce Young's taking the 11 touchdowns that, Jalen Hurts got. So
Right.
Miles Sanders, I think, could be somebody to target that, probably when they get in and around the goal line, he's going to be their key weapon. So I do like him. But as you said, add value. The guys like Thielen, Chark, Mingo,
Yeah.
Hayden Hurst is your third tight end, super
Yeah.
late.
Right.
I mean, these
Yeah.
guys are
Yeah.
going to,
More like a late
yeah,
team value type of
yeah, these
situation.
guys are
Yeah.
going to play. It would not surprise me if they're better than expected. One that I would highlight, go down,
Mm-hmm.
Atlanta Falcons right there,
Okay.
14. They actually had pretty decent numbers last year, 54 attempts,
Yeah.
55.6. They got a lot going for them. They invested in the offensive line, obviously getting Bijan Robinson, Ritter, his second year,
Yeah.
Kyle Pitts, back the
Coming
full
back.
way, Drake
Right.
London, his second year. So that's an offense that, I don't think they're going to be challenging the Chiefs and Cowboys and Eagles for total red zone attempts. But I think when they get near there, they're going to be scoring some touchdowns.
No, I think that's a great point. Anyone else that you want to look at? And then did you want to look at any other data points like just total yards or anything like that? Which
Yeah,
obviously
no, I think right now we've covered this. I would look total yards. I think is a key point.
I'm just going to scroll up and just take a quick look at it. Just again, as you go through these pro football reference and looking at the team offensive stats, um, you know, that is important. And again, you're
Yeah,
going to see the usual suspects.
yeah,
I will say that a lot of people, it feels like the best ball community does not give enough credit to Dallas,
yeah,
they get knocked more than they get credited. But if you look at all these data points of scoring offense, obviously the red zone efficiency, red zone trips, yards, they're ranking in 1 to 10 and 1 to 12 in most of them. And again, that is with Dak sitting out 5 games last year.
yeah,
So I just want to kind of make that point that's something that helped me last year. Again, you'll hear me say it a lot. My BBM3 team stacked up 4 Cowboys, and in talking about stacking up a team, that was one I was mainly looking at the schedule and saying, well, people are high on the Eagles. Guess what? Dallas has an easy schedule too. The NFC East had a very easy schedule last year. Let me try to stack up the Cowboys. I can get their ADP value much better. And even with Dak being out, I got Dak, Elliott, Gallup, and Schultz, and we'll talk more about that when you kind of spread out ADP. And I still had access to a top scoring offense, and I
yeah.
just want to point that out, that I just feel like the best ball world is a little too down on the Cowboys. And again, as a Washington fan, that's hard to let that come out of my mouth, but it's true. It's true, right?
Yeah, and that's a perfect example. The players you cited, because you didn't get their first or second fantasy score, Lamb and
Mm-hmm.
Pollard, but you got
Right.
the other guys, and obviously they, Schultz and Gallup especially would have even been better. You knew about the Gallup injury going
You're
in.
right.
Schultz injury was unfortunate.
Yeah.
They definitively both would have been better if they were healthier, and also speaks to the Cowboys offense likely being better. Not just the Dak injury, but because there was so much opportunity, so many yards, so many points scored, those guys
Mm-hmm.
could still put up usable points, and you're
Yep.
getting them at value
Right.
um, for the most part, and that paid off, and that's able to pay off. And those are the teams where if you're not getting their first couple guys, their most used guys, you can still get pretty good value from them.
Right.
And we saw that with other, excuse me.
Gallup's going very late again this year.
Yeah, with Brandon Cooks. But this is a Dallas team that when they had Amari Cooper, they were running 3 wide receiver sets, and these
Hmm.
guys were crushing. So,
Right.
I think Gallup is definitely a good target. But look at some of the other teams that we mentioned. A team like the Jaguars, where it wasn't just Christian Kirk, it wasn't just Travis Etienne.
Yep.
It was Ingram, it was Zay Jones.
Zay Jones.
Marvin
Yeah.
Jones even had a couple spike weeks, like 20-point games. So, when you have good offenses, you know, fantasy points will follow. And yards is another important thing. And I do think it gets overblown or ignored. But again, just look at those top 10 teams all over 6,000 yards and,
Hmm.
just go down a little bit. Um, when we get to, even a team like the Giants, who, obviously Daniel Jones and Saquon Barkley were fine fantasy wise, but they really didn't have much else. And those guys did it all. But beyond that, they didn't have weapons that were producing getting yards after the catch, moving the chains,
Hmm.
and you see that reflected in the yardage. Like no other fantasy player would have been really good over the course of a season. And sure, they had some injuries at wide receiver. That's part of it. But Cleveland Browns, Nick Chubb, Amari Cooper. That's who you wanted.
Hmm.
Guys like David Njoku and even Donovan Peoples-Jones, they had a couple okay weeks, but it was tougher for them because the yardage was just not there at the same level. And that's at the 13th team.
Right.
Um, Now, if you look at the very bottom, if you could go down to the very bottom, these are the teams that it was really tough to get fantasy usage of. I mean,
Hmm.
Chicago Bears, we know what Justin Fields was. We know Cole Kmet had a couple big games. David Montgomery had a couple games, but their receivers, just this offense in general, just was not producing the yards needed to sustain any receivers. And I mean, even if Mooney didn't get didn't get injured, he would have been a widely overpicked player where he was going last year.
Right.
Titans I mentioned before. Obviously, Big Dog was amazing, but everyone else, their tight ends, their receivers, Traylon Burks was getting so much steam. Just had no chance to pay off.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
Efficient in the red zone, but only 5,000 yards basically. Yeah.
exactly, and that's why it was Henry or bust
Yep.
if you're utilizing this team for fantasy. And
Absolutely.
we see that these teams, and some, of course, you can point to the injuries. Obviously, the Rams, Cup
Right.
getting injured, Stafford getting
Stafford.
injured.
Yeah.
Like their whole offensive line. Hopefully, they can bounce back, but. Some young teams, obviously Pittsburgh's a great example of that.
Hmm.
But yeah, some of these teams were just downright inefficient. And
Yeah.
Falcons, I mentioned before. Will they get enough yards to sustain these guys? Hopefully, there's a good case for it, as I mentioned, with all this
Right.
young upside talent. But that's going to be a factor. If they don't, one or two will probably pay off, but probably not all of them.
Right. Right. And that's why when you're looking to target maybe some value teams, maybe some teams that do turn it around yardage wise, red zone wise, scoring wise, we mentioned a couple of these teams. Like you said, you mentioned the Falcons. I mentioned the Jets. I mentioned the Steelers. We mentioned the Broncos. These are all teams that, based on kind of either guys coming back from injury, second year growth, coaching changes, free agency changes, they could, be in this top 10 or 12. But you have to, project that. I mean, can they be the Lions and Jaguars? You need to ask those questions for
Yeah.
kind of all the changes that were made in the off season. And that's what's hard. That's what
Oh,
all it
absolutely.
takes a deeper look at all of this to kind of settle in on, okay, this is who I think is going to be like the top 12 offenses. And a lot of them are going to be what last year was. And these are kind of my, maybe 4 dark horses as to who could kind of make their way up there. So I think that's something to really talk through. Now let's talk through, just talking through the ways to attack stacking up an offense, right? We never want to overstack. We're not saying to get, 6 pieces of one offense. I'm saying that we find it beneficial that 2 to 4 range that you can stack up these good offenses and get value. And one thing you might look at, number one way we go about doing is looking at condensed offenses. So
Yeah.
speak to that first.
Yeah, so condensed offenses are definitely a big thing that we can look at. And that's really where you can get, especially if you are paying premiums.
Right.
That's where you can get guys to pay off. And the two best examples of this are, of course, Miami and Philly. Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, both were going in the first couple rounds. Of course, AJ Brown and Devonta Smith have a slightly bigger gap between them, but very similar.
Right.
Typically, it's tough for two receivers that high to pay off because it almost feels like they're eating each other. Even when they both have, good 18-point games, you're just not getting enough of those 20, 25-point games. And when they do those, they're not, you're thinking, oh, could they be getting those 35-point games? Well, these offenses could. One, the offenses were really good, scored a lot of points, got a lot of yards, but it went to these guys. You look at the Eagles, Dallas Goedert was third in targets, and he was pretty respectable, but he also missed 4 games, which played a big role into Brown and Smith. When he was out, it just became the Brown and Smith show from a passing standpoint. And, that really paid off for them. And of course, same with the Dolphins, like the whole Mike Gesicki, Cedric Wilson, these guys that we thought, they signed, they paying good money for, did not materialize in the passing game. And the running game was a 2-man race between Wilson and Mostert. Neither contribute a ton from the passing game either. So that led so many targets to Hill and Waddle, especially Hill, obviously. And that's why they could both have these massive spike weeks, especially, if you only highlight their games with Tua, their numbers are truly off the charts. It was the games with Teddy and Skylar Thompson that kind of brought them down a few pegs. So if you can find those core condensed offenses and get those pieces, that's key, because this is the thing. If you tried stacking Tua last year and say you got Hill or Waddle, at that point you should stop. Maybe you take Mostert late. Obviously we didn't know
Mostert
Jeff Wilson
was a late round hero. Yeah.
We didn't even know Jeff Wilson would be on this team. But yes, Edmonds failed out. They traded him as part of the Bradley Chubb deal. But grabbing Gesicki, that was negative weight. Grabbing a Cedric Wilson or guessing on some other third receiver was not going to help you in the slightest. And same with the Eagles. If you got Miles Sanders, great. He was really good.
No, we love the running back situation. We're talking about like the third, fourth receiver. Let's be clear. We loved Miles Sanders. We loved Mostert as the late round. He was a late round hero for me. We're talking about these third, fourth receivers or, second tight ends, it's just hard to see the value. And it wasn't getting there last year for the Eagles, the Dolphins. Like you mentioned, did you want Quez Watkins? No,
absolutely not. And even Goddard, even though Goddard was good, it was still, given just where you were drafting him, it was tough to spend that much, because he was going pretty high as well. So that's the other part of it as well, is getting them at some sort of value. But when you can find the condensed offenses and get those pieces, that's great. But if you miss out on what you kind of think are the condensed pieces, Bengals are another one. We know it's going to be Chase, we know it's going to be Higgins, and we know Tyler Boyd's are going to be pretty good. Do I want Trenton Irwin? Do I want, Irv Smith? Probably not.
No.
It becomes very, very thin at that point.
Yeah, you don't need to force it just to say I stacked up Joe Burrow, and we'll get to this later, but on these condensed offenses, we're not saying to like jam 3 Eagles, jam 3 Dolphins, jam 3 Bengals. First of all, a lot of cases it's impossible. And second of all, it probably would work better on like true season long formats like drafters. I know there's a season long component to the BBM4 on Underdog, but we're not saying to like go try to force a Chase Higgins Burrow stack every time, or a Tua Waddle Hill stack every time. Again, first of all, I don't know if these are how feasible they are, but we're not saying to do that with these. We're saying get the condensed pieces. Say you do get Tua Hill, you couldn't get Waddle or whatever. Don't feel like you have to get Cedric or whoever their third or fourth receiver is this year. I'm still learning all the depth charts at this point in May. Okay. So I think that covers condensed offenses. Now let's go into picking the players on the right players in the offense, and kind of conversely, the Chiefs, they were the top on every single data point we looked at on these charts, right? Scoring, red zone efficiency, trips to the red zone, yards, they're the top. They're who you wanted. You succeeded if you stack the Chiefs, but you needed the right Chiefs. And to that point, Mahomes before the season basically said, listen, I'm not, outside of Kelsey, he really couldn't say who was going to be his guy. It wasn't very clear going into the season, but you had to stack the right Chiefs. It ultimately ended up being, of course, Travis Kelsey, number one first and foremost. At ADP value, it was McKinnon was a late round hero, and then Juju was the third piece. You did not want any of those other pieces, Sky Moore, Hardman,
MVS.
MVS. Thank you. There were so many other pieces. That is an offense there. You could have picked like 6 or 7 pieces. You only wanted those 3 with that max with Mahomes max. And that's just something to be clear on again, that again, they're even in the top offenses, they're not all going to get there. That's the point we're trying to make, I think, as far as like that, finding that sweet spot of stacking 2 to 4 of them. But also, that you do have to pick the right one. So speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah. So, in these situations, whether it's the second receiver, who the tight end is going to be, what the running back breakdown is going to be, and the Chiefs were a great example because both receiver and running back were up in the air.
Yeah.
You
very much
just find the right one, pick the point, I think, is pick the one instead of trying to get multiple in your lineup. Because if you went the Chiefs route and took MVS, Sky Moore, and Hardman, Hardman had a couple usable weeks, but that was it. Like, you just wasted 3 picks to get 4 usable weeks, and not even necessarily the greatest useful weeks outside of one.
Right.
If you are overstacking that running back situation, we knew the Chiefs were not going to be a run first team by any stretch. Maybe one running back's going to hit value, but 2 or 3 of them. I mean, Ronald Jones did nothing on the team.
Right.
Clyde Edwards-Helaire was just not it. And it's finding those guys, and that's where you need to make your stand. And the point is to not try and hammer the position for unsettled situations.
Right.
Kind
of make your stands on it.
A good example this year right now looks to be, say, the Bears or the Dolphins.
Yep.
Right now, there's 3 guys in both of those situations. For the Bears, Khalil Herbert, they brought in Donta Foreman, and of course the rookie Rashawn Johnson. Take your stand, take one of them, but don't try and take all 3. Dolphins, one of the top offenses we just talked about. Mostert and Wilson both were re-signed, and of course they draft Devin Achane.
Yeah.
Again, take one of them, but don't try and take multiple, because one, you might totally guess wrong and you take 2, and the third one is the one who breaks out, and one of your guys is getting zeros the entire year.
Yeah. And we'll get into, again, it's going to be a ton of best ball content every week here on the FanSpeak Network. That's why it's a great idea to like this episode. And of course, subscribe to the FanSpeak Network. Tons of content that we look forward to talking strategy, live drafts. We just did a Anthony Richardson debate. We're going to be doing that each and every week. So be sure to subscribe to see what usable weeks is going to be something that we talk about. That is a big lesson that I learned when I looked at my teams that did not do well. It was because, for various reasons, I was getting a lot of unusable weeks from these players. And that's where you have to be careful in situations like this. And we're not saying, like, obviously in one draft, you could try to draft a chain, and in another draft, draft Mostert. We're just saying in the same draft, it doesn't make any sense. So I think that's good, is just, kind of making your stands on picking the right guys in the offense. I'd also say, and we'll talk about this later in the summer, not to overreact too much to camp reports and that kind of stuff. I mean, my goodness, when training camp comes along, we can do a whole probably 4-part series on that. Because my God, did I overreact to some camp reports, Sky Moore being one of them, by the way. I mean, holy crap, was I drafting the hell out of Sky Moore in early August. And that was not it. That was not it. So, okay. So condensed offenses, players on a not as condensed offense, finding the right players in a high-powered offense. Number 3, I would say, is be open to non-traditional stacks. I think sometimes people will say, oh, well, I want to stack up, whatever, the Dolphins or the Vikings or Dallas. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. Well, I need to get Dak and 3 of his receivers. No, that's not exactly how you have to do it. In fact, that's probably the less likely path for that stack to work. The more likely path for that stack to work, and again, this also feeds into the next point about balancing the ADP of stacking up good offenses, is to get, be willing to do a quarterback, running back, tight end receiver, or quarterback receiver, tight end, or quarterback, running back receiver, something along those lines. And even if you don't get the quarterback, say you try to start stacking up a team, someone snipes you and you don't get the quarterback, no big deal. We saw that in the, someone posted the winning DraftKings lineup. They were clearly going for an Eagles stack. Didn't they have Devonta Smith and Miles Sanders, Steve?
Not Sanders. They had Brown, Smith, and then later took Kenneth Gainwell. So yeah, they
Okay.
were in on the
Yeah, they were
Eagles.
clearly trying to stack up the Eagles and could and didn't. And then they just pivoted. Okay, no big deal. They didn't have Hurts. That would have been nice, but they didn't get Hurts. They were able to pivot. They won $1 million. They're good. But the point is, it's okay to have a running back receiver or a running back receiver tight end, and then you didn't get their quarterback. That's okay. You're still getting valuable. Say you tried to go get Lawrence and he got sniped. No big deal. If I still got, ETN, Zay Jones, Ingram, sounds great. I've got a healthy dose at various ADPs to a top offense. So that's the point is to be willing to stack up more than just quarterback receiver. Quarterback receiver, it can be quarterback running back receiver, quarterback tight end. Utilize all the positions to get your team stacks. And that's, I think, ultimately probably going to work out better in the end. And it's what worked out for me. Again, I keep bringing up my BBM3 team, which I think had major legs and just kind of let me down with my stars just did not get there in Justin Jefferson. Obviously Higgins didn't play and one or two other pieces, but I had 4 pieces of the Dallas offense. As I mentioned earlier, Dak, Elliott, Gallup, and Schultz. And so, as you can see, it was one in each position. And let me tell you, even with Dak and Schultz missing time, it worked out for me because we saw Dallas, the yards, the red zone efficiency, the scoring. They were a top scoring offense. And I got 4 pieces of that. And it wasn't even CD Lamb, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, no, I think that is key, especially for some of these teams where you are drafting the quarterback, say, ahead of their primary pass catchers.
Right.
The Bears. If you take Justin Fields, don't feel you have to take DJ Moore. Like maybe just settle for Cole Kmet. And that's an
especially
offense
with the
where,
running quarterbacks.
Yeah, and that's slightly different than being a running quarterback. But if you take Trevor Lawrence and hadn't already taken Calvin Ridley, who's probably already gone, Christian Kirk is close, but maybe he gets sniped before your next pick. Pivot, take Evan Ingram, take Zay Jones, something like that. Same, Cowboys are another one. If CD Lamb's already gone and just whatever reason you're going back to the Dak well, yeah, look for Brandon Cooks, look for Michael Gallup, take a shot at one of their young tight ends. Again, don't overstack those young tight ends. Don't take 2 of them.
Just get one. Yeah.
But that type of thing where I think it is absolutely key. You go Cousins, Addison, Hawkinson. That's a great stack. Yeah, you didn't get Justin Jefferson, but that's probably a pretty condensed offense. And you got the second and third piece with a quarterback who's very high volume last year. So don't just always feel like, oh, I have to marry it to the top guy on the offense. Yeah, that can be great, and that is amazing. But sometimes getting that second and third guy is just as good.
Absolutely. And that leads us right into balancing the ADPs, right? We kind of mentioned, we touched on it with in those condensed offenses. That is, again, it looks sexy to have Burrow, Chase, Higgins, or Hill, Waddle, Tua. But when you're using all of your equity up at the top, I think it would work better on a site that's purely season long, like Drafters, as opposed to the playoff format. But I think that's a bit risky, especially in the playoff format sites, to put all that equity up top with basically 1, 2, 3 is going all to one team. So, I think that's just something to keep in mind. And again, the Dallas stack that I talked about was 4, and I did it with, other teams too, that I'd have anywhere from, 3 to 4 players. I think it worked better when the ADPs were balanced. Maybe one guy's early, one guy's middle, one guy's late, or, in the case of Dallas, I think Zeke was 4th round. Obviously Dak was, I don't know, maybe 7th round. Schultz was a little later, and then Gallup somewhere in that range was late, or later. So again, it was a balanced ADP kind of just distribution. That's kind of what we're saying. If you're going to stack up 4 players from one team, I think it's going to be pretty hard to get there, especially in the playoff format, if it's like 4 in the top 6 or 3 in the top 3 or 4. So kind of speak to that a little bit further.
Yeah. And it's just because, yes, the idea, if you get 2 of these receivers, whether it's some of the ones we mentioned, or even like a Ridley Kirk with Lawrence, which is a much more feasible thing that you can get all 3 of those guys by taking Ridley first. But the problem with that is you're kind of using like your 3rd, 4th, and 5th pick, or 3rd, 5th, and 6th, something like that. And those are all key starters, obviously quarterback being one of them. And your hope is that the receivers just keep oscillating. One has a 25-point week
Yep.
here, one has a 30-point week there, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem is, and maybe we will see more passing coming back this year. But last year, we did not see a lot of games where you had two receivers going off for 25, 30 points in a single game. It happened a few times, don't get me wrong.
Waddle Hill were the biggest examples.
Waddle Hill were definitely those. But look at the Eagles were actually a case of that. Like it was a lot of one week it's Brown, next week it's Smith. The other might still get 17 points, which is good. But when we're talking about those finals or advancement in a certain week, you might be facing another top tier team. And if, you're counting on Brown and Smith and they're counting on, two top receivers from two different teams, let's say Devontae Adams and Higgins, similar ADPs for the Brown Smith. Maybe Higgins is the one who's the number one on the Bengals that week, and Devontae Adams is doing what Devontae Adams does. So it's going to be very hard for two receivers from one team to hit those optimal outcomes to match those.
Or maybe you were able to get, one of the Eagles receivers and then Higgins or something like that.
Yeah. So that's just kind of where we're talking about where in those singular playoff weeks, it's going to be tough for them to both get those elite outcomes. It's not impossible. Like we said, there are still a couple examples last year, and maybe we do see a lot more passing this season, but that's just something to keep in mind of, since, we always talk about how much money is in these playoff weeks. It's not always optimal. Yes, you're kind of not guaranteed, to get the top receiver from the team that week,
right?
If you have those two guys, but there's a good chance, of course.
Right.
But it's also the other guy might not even be good enough to count that week, and that.
The winning BBM3 lineup last year, Pat Crane's lineup didn't have Mike Evans, who smashed in week 17, but he did have Godwin, who was great.
So that is an example.
That's a perfect example. He didn't have both.
Both receivers did well enough that week, but again, you needed Tom Brady to put up 40 plus fantasy points.
Right.
There were not many of those types of games last year.
But Pat Crane might have not even made the finals. If Mike Evans was drafted in the second or third round last year?
Third round, late second, early third. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if that was, he had Barkley, I don't know if that was Barkley or something.
Was a second round pick.
Say he had to take Evans over Barkley. Well, he might have not, based on Evans' season, he might have not even made the playoffs, if that was a 1v1. And because he took Barkley and then just took Godwin as part of the stack, again, it's wild that he won it without Evans and with Godwin. Godwin was great. That's a perfect example of how if he would have forced, I need Evans and Godwin, he might have not even made it, just because that offense we saw the list, they were not high powered enough to probably sustain both receivers to get him to the playoffs, right?
Yeah. But even, that's an example of a game where it was actually okay to have the top two receivers and still be successful. Most cases, that's not. Most cases where we saw a 30-point fantasy game, how many games when Devontae Adams had 30 fantasy points or Justin Jefferson had 30 fantasy points
was a second receiver,
Renfro, Waller, even Hawkinson. Hawkinson had one or two with Jefferson.
That's an outlier.
Typically speaking, you were not getting two guys to really go off in even some of the top tier offenses. Again, like there was one game where I know Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis went off, but the other games where Gabe Davis kind of went off and had those mega spike weeks were kind of weeks where Diggs was a little back. He was not terrible, made 14 fantasy points, but
he was a first round pick. But for a first, exactly.
Yeah, again, it's a solid floor. It's a solid floor game, but it's not winning you the big prize if it happens week 16, week 17.
Exactly. So I think let's give the summary action items from this is we are focusing, again, some of all parts when you look at best ball strategies, but one of our biggest focuses this season that we don't think is being talked about enough is stacking up top offenses. And again, you can do that in various ways. Number one, look for condensed offenses. We mentioned a couple of them, like the Dolphins and Bengals and Eagles. Number two, look for the right pieces of an offense, like the Chiefs. They were top in every single offensive category. You want pieces of the Chiefs. Well, you need the right pieces of the Chiefs.
And don't overstack those pieces when you're trying to guess.
Exactly. Don't overstack, the condensed offenses, or just because it is the Chiefs and it's the right offenses. Again, last year you only wanted 3 guys max with Mahomes. Anybody else was absolutely unusable for their ADPs and not really helpful to your team at all. So you want to pick the right pieces to the offense and don't overstack it. Don't try to get, again, a Quez Watkins or a Trenton Irwin just to say, I got, a 4th piece to the Bengals. Don't force that. Try to get the right pieces to the top offenses. That's number 2. Number 3 is be willing to, with that in mind, stack up not just a quarterback and 3 receivers, or quarterback. You can do a quarterback with running backs, receivers, and tight ends. So, what worked for me was a quarterback, running back, receiver, tight end. That top offense in the Dallas got me a trip to the BBM3 finals. I like that, just being able to stack top offenses, but not always forcing stacks, kind of in the traditional, multi-receiver way. You can also, if you miss out on a quarterback, don't give up. Just say, okay, I still want to get a running back and a tight end, or a running back, receiver, tight end. That's okay. You can still get 2 or 3 pieces of these top offenses, even if you miss out on that quarterback. So I think that's important. And then finally, number 4, what we just mentioned, balance that ADP out. You have to run really pure to, to get there if you're spending your first 3 picks on one team. So just having that balance in an ADP, again, it might work a little bit better on a site like Drafters as a season long, but in general, I would say work to balance out that ADP when you're stacking up a team. Any final thoughts before we get out of here, Steve?
No, I think that's good.
Well, I think we summed it up good. Again, if you are new to Drafters or Underdog, be sure to use that code FANSPEAK it's on both actually, that code FANSPEAK for 100% deposit bonus up to $100 on Drafters on Underdog Fantasy, and get in and start doing these best ball drafts now. We'll have a live draft up this week too. And again, be sure to like this episode and subscribe to the FANSPEAK Network, because tons of best ball content all summer long, strategy shows, live drafts, and more. So with that, we thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time.